Well, good morning, everyone. I'm going to try to speak a little today about something I hope is interesting, useful, and perhaps just a little bit different. I thought I would look at the law of evolution as it applies to the natural world and see if we can find some underlying principles that we can take from that and apply to the world of electronic payments. Sir Winston Churchill once wrote, "The further back you look, the further forward you can see." So perhaps by looking back at what's happened in nature, we can look forward to see how payments, e-payments, will evolve in the future. Our very first speaker, Mr. Godfrey, made an interesting point about the possible decline of payment cards. And I'm going to come back to that later. He's now wondering, of course, what I'm going to say, but you have nothing to worry about, I assure you. So, let's have a look at how certain aspects of the e-payments environment have evolved over time and where they may go in the future. It's a big subject. I realise we're running a little bit late, so I will only be able to give a very high-level introduction, and I'm happy to take questions afterwards. The law of evolution was originally propounded at the end of the 19th century by two men, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, who independently came up with the idea. They published a joint paper together and then separately published two books, The Origin of the Species, which is very well known, and The Malay Archipelago, which is just as good, just as important, but perhaps a little bit less well known. This, in essence, is what the law of evolution comes down to, that all species arise and develop through the natural selection of small inherited variations that increase the individual's ability to compete, survive, and reproduce. Now, if we take that as a basic thesis, let's see if we can apply that to the world of electronic payments and then get an idea of where they'll be going in the future. To give an example, a concrete example from the world of e-payments, let's have a look at the beak of the finch. All these birds, where are we? I'm afraid the pointer's not coming up, never mind. All these birds are finches on the Galapagos Islands. They're all part of the same family. If you look at the beaks, you can see that the shape of the beak varies. It varies depending on the type of food the bird is eating. Over on the left, you have birds that eat fruit. At the top of the arch, you can see the beak is long and thin, so the bird can reach into the plant to get at the seeds. On the right-hand side, you see the bird has a very massive, heavy beak. It's a kind of nutcracker. They eat seeds with very thick skins. So the lower segments show how the birds are exploiting every possible kind of food source. In the middle of the arch, the pink and the red, the left-hand side, the birds are living in trees and bushes. The right-hand side, birds are living on the ground. So the important point there is that the birds are exploiting every food resource and every habitat. So those are ideas we can perhaps take forwards and expand into the world of e-payments. People have taken the law of evolution and applied it to culture and to behavior. Professor Richard Dawkins has done that and came up with the concept of the meme, which is behavior, types of behavior, that are passed from one generation to another. So it's taking the law of evolution from nature and applying it to human societies. What happens now if we apply this law of nature to the world of e-payments? Are there parallels we can draw? E-payments is a huge subject. I'm just going to home in on payment cards. So back in 1887, someone wrote a novel where they suggested the idea of paying for things with a payment card. Most people have no idea that the card in your wallet today goes back to an idea from 1887. But that's where the idea started. The payment card then came into the real world, where certain hotel chains and certain oil companies produced payment cards for use in a single hotel or at a single set of petrol stations. They evolved into bank cards, and the first credit card comes up in the 1940s. And you can see from the slide, you get the Diners card and you get the Bank Americard. Who's ever heard of a Bank Americard? But we all know Visa. See, the Bank Americard evolved into Visa. And MasterCharge, well, that's evolved into MasterCard. So the payment cards have a long history, and we need to consider where they're going next. How they've evolved in the past may set them up for their future evolutionary progress. The initial cards were personal. It's your card. They are local. You can only use them in that particular hotel or at that particular oil company's petrol stations. So they were very closed. They had a very limited space for use, but they were practical. People believed them to be practical, useful, and convenient. That's why people started to use them, and that's why they've actually grown in use. They are still practical and convenient. But they were, and they remain today, a physical payment token. You need that piece of plastic when you go to the ATM or the point of sale terminal, typically. So let's take that principle from the law of natural evolution, that small inherited variations increase the individual's ability to compete and survive. So how have these cards evolved? They started out as local, but now they're becoming global. We're seeing cards coming up for different segments of society, for students, for retired people, special cards for farmers, for particular segments of industry. Now remember the beak of the finch. Those birds exploited all the possible habitats and all the possible foodstuffs. So we're seeing payment cards, and we've seen over time that cards have gone into different niches. They've served and are serving different segments of society, different industries, different trades. So that is a trend I'm suggesting will continue. We'll come on to that in a moment. But we're seeing cards focused on particular interest groups. I've put up a couple here just as examples. We all know how incredibly popular the Harry Potter novels have been. I don't know whether anybody has produced a Harry Potter associated card, but you can see in principle how once something like Harry Potter takes off, you can ride the wave of popularity with a payment card product. So the marketing departments of card issuers are surely looking for these opportunities now. So we're seeing niches evolving, and you need to be dynamic and active to see the niche coming and then get in quickly and ride the wave of popularity, serve the demand as it develops. I just skipped over one point there, local cards at the very end. The city of Bristol in the UK has issued its own currency. You can only use it in the city of Bristol. So you go to Bristol with pound sterling or euro or whatever it is, you exchange it for the Bristol pound, which can only be used in the city. The idea is that the money stays within that particular city. So the local environment is stimulated. Now, is that Bristol pound going to evolve into a Bristol card? I don't know. It could do. So there are niches and opportunities all the time. It takes some creative thinking to detect or to stimulate demand and to open up these kind of niches. There are an increasing number of points of acceptance. So instead of being just a card for that particular hotel, that particular oil company, they're now globally accepted. The Visa, MasterCard and other brands are accepted worldwide. And that trend is continuing. More and more POS acquirers are coming up in the world as a whole. The number of outlets, and there's just constant growth in that area. The card started as a physical piece of plastic. Now we've seen that evolve into the virtual world, where virtual cards are available. And there are also one-time use cards. You can access a bank's online system and you can say, please issue me a prepaid virtual card, one-time use. You use it and it's gone. This is used in some countries where the client is very concerned about internet security. You want to make a purchase, but you don't want to expose your normal debit card to the internet. So there's a new niche that's evolved. It's not a traditional merchant, it's an online merchant. It's not a traditional piece of plastic, it's a virtual card. So we're seeing the evolution of these payment products into the virtual world. The world of mobile payments is also starting to impact cards. In Bangladesh, they started to issue people with e-wallets, and the people were transacting using the e-money, e-wallets through the mobile. The bank said, yes, here's a niche, here's an opportunity we haven't yet exploited, and they've now issued cards, payment cards, to go with the e-wallet. So interestingly, mobile financial services has driven in certain areas the growth and development of payment cards. There are extinctions, which brings me back to the point our first speaker made. Usually, for something to become extinct in the natural world, you need a tipping point. Populations can decline, and the use of payment cards may well decline. For the product or the animal to actually become extinct, it needs a tipping point. The first ATM cards are definitely extinct. The first cards used in the UK were thin pieces of plastic. You'd go into the branch and you'd buy one card for, let's say, £10. When you wanted to withdraw £10 from the ATM, you'd go to the ATM, put the card in, and the ATM would retain the card. And it would just give you £10. That's the first ATM card in the UK. Those have gone. Nobody uses those anymore. Who's used in the last 12 months one of the old zip-zap machines? Anybody? They've gone. In the old days, when the plastic card was embossed, you'd put it through a manual machine. Some of the young people may never have used one, right? But they've gone. They're extinct. You can't put a chipped card through one of those machines. It'll destroy it. How many purely private label cards are there still in the world? Very, very few. I wouldn't go so far as to say they're extinct, but they are in decline. What about non-chipped cards? They're in decline as well. The world is moving towards EMV chipped cards. What about NFC? Lots and lots of cards now are carrying the NFC payment facility. Is that trend going to continue? And how will that affect chipped cards? Will you see the death of the magnetic stripe card? How will chip cards and NFC sit together? So these things are related and constantly changing. I'll move to say a few words about mobile payments, and these things just didn't appear. Mobile payments just didn't appear out of nothing. On the lower right-hand side, we have one of the birds of paradise from New Guinea. On the other side of the slide, we have a lizard. And the two just don't appear to be related, but they are part of an evolutionary trend. Paleontologists have found the fossil of Archaeopteryx, which is sitting in the middle. It actually has teeth like a lizard, but unlike a bird. It has claws on the tips of its wings, like a lizard, not like a bird. And it has a long, bony tail, like a lizard, not like a bird, but it flies and it's covered in feathers, just like a bird. So the lizards, the dinosaurs, evolve gradually into the birds we see today. But when you look at the two ends of the evolutionary scale, they wouldn't initially appear to be related, but they are. Part of the trick as payment service providers and payment product issuers is to try to see where the trend is going. And I agree with the suggestion from the first speaker that the world of payment cards is in decline. Payment cards will be displaced gradually by other forms of payment. And as a bank, as a card issuer, as a card processor, we need to think how to respond to that. So for mobile payments, we see a wide range of payment services. They're easy to use, easy to understand, widely available. And not just with the high-end telephones, they're available with the cheaper phones as well. They started out, as you may remember, with SMS payments. And I remember going to Saudi Arabia and seeing the instruction book for their SMS banking services, and it was massive. Half Arabic, half English. But by the time you could do a balance inquiry very easily, but by the time you came to do more complicated transactions, the SMS was half a mile long, and the chances of making a mistake was huge. That's now evolved. Almost nobody does that these days. People have moved on to more sophisticated, more highly evolved mobile financial services. They're still easy to use, they're still easy to understand. So there are basic principles that run through the evolution of these products. But what you can do with a mobile phone today is way in excess of anything that SMS banking gave. So the product, the service has expanded to develop and to exploit all the available niches. Many mobile payment services are based on a bank account. They're bank controlled. You have to be a bank customer to use it. And it's an evolution of an existing banking channel. It's just a further development of banking channels. Other systems, mobile payment systems, are based on an e-wallet. So a mobile network operator or a third party, if it's appropriately licensed by the regulator, can move into that field. Now there's competition, right? The banks were using mobile as a delivery channel to extend their customer base, to extend their services. We're now seeing competitors moving in. So this is like a predator in the natural world moving into a new environment. The prey has to respond, has to evolve. So banks will be faced, traditional banks will be faced with the challenge of new entrants coming into their environment. I'll say a word in a moment about how evolutionary responses can be seen. So we're seeing variations in technology that have driven the development of cards and mobile payments, seeing variations in the service providers, new providers coming in. We're seeing the evolution of new services. The old SMS-based services couldn't deliver. The new services can. So we have opening up a large new niche of service users, people who never were involved in the e-banking world, in the electronic ecosystem, are suddenly able to move in, and that gives tremendous opportunities, tremendous opportunities. Competition, I've broken this down into two forms. I'm suggesting evolution for expansion, which is deliberate. You sit down and you think deliberately what new niches are out there. How can we expand this product to serve new customers, new geographies? What can we deliberately do to expand niches where we're already operating? There's also the evolution for survival, where you act in response to outside stimuli. That could be regulatory change. It could be something your competitor is doing, but you have to react. And reactions tend to be drives for efficiency, specific initiatives. And one underlying principle is sustainability. There's no point in making an investment in a product or service that has no longevity, that's here today and gone tomorrow. You want something that's going to run for a while. The natural world tends to be the same. Evolution is for sustainability. In the natural world, there are two approaches to responding to the environment. If you look at humankind, we live from the North Pole to the equator, and from the equator around to the South Pole. We are the supreme generalists. We're not very strong. We don't run very quickly. We haven't got really sharp teeth. At least I haven't. But somehow we're adaptable. We change very easily, very readily to meet the new environments, to meet the new opportunities, and to deal with the new threats. Something on the other side of the spectrum, like the giant panda, is highly specialized. It only eats the tips of certain bamboo plants, and they only grow in certain areas. So the giant panda is very successful in that niche. But if that niche is threatened, the panda is in serious trouble, which it is at the moment with encroaching human populations and with the changing environment. So the question then, taking it from the natural world into the world of e-payments, is how specialized should you be? If you have a highly profitable segment that's very, very focused, it may be very good for business today, but where do you stand if that niche suddenly closes up? Is it better to be a generalist? But then, can you market yourselves? People talk about having a USP, unique selling proposition. If you're a generalist, maybe you can survive, but how do you get your message across clearly to your audience? So, some key points I would take away from the natural world and from the world of e-payments is that flexibility is vital and the willingness to change is vital. So this is coming down to attitude, to the culture in the organization that embraces change. Humankind embraces change. We change naturally, and we have done for thousands and thousands of years as an animal, as a species. Businesses need to be able to do the same, and having that attitude in the staff, building up that attitude in the staff is important. And the ability to change also comes down to the underlying technical architecture. How flexible can you be? I know from experience certain British banks are facing major problems with legacy systems. It's simply a massive job to change them to meet the evolving environment. So choosing the right software vendor as a partner, choosing the right hardware vendor as a partner is very important. You have to have that flexibility to dynamically change your services and the way those services work and are delivered. Big questions come as to what changes can we expect in the external environment. We see changes in demographics. The population in this part of the world is generally quite young. The average population is quite young. That would tend to drive youth-oriented products, products for young people, products for young families. If you're looking at Japan, Western Europe, you have a generally aging population. So the demographic drive there is products and services for older people, for retired people. Customs unions and countries coming together in regional collaboration. We see the EU, we see the GCC, we see Russia trying to build up its own customs union. How are these changes in the environment going to affect what you do? The original focus on highly localized services is beginning to dissolve. So there's a greater demand coming for regional products, regional services. How do you respond to that? How are you allowed to respond to that? What's the underlying legislation? How is that going to change and evolve? And how do you use that to your best advantage? We're seeing cost reduction through what's known as buy your own. I suspect that, I'll come on to this in a bit more detail later, but I suspect the traditional point-of-sale networks are going to slowly decline. Why would you invest in a massive traditional card-based point-of-sale merchant network with all the headaches there are in maintaining those point-of-sale terminals when you can offer a similar service through the mobile channel where the client buys their own technology? How can you take that principle and apply it to other services you're offering? We're seeing a lot of cost reduction through infrastructure sharing. Now, if you start to see that, for example, check usage is declining, why invest in your own check printing infrastructure? If you believe that payment cards are going to start declining in use, for how much longer will you make investments in your card production and card processing architectures? So these questions start to affect very directly the strategies that you will take in your respective organizations. So infrastructure sharing is something that I would see increasing. This is where things like KNet has moved gradually at the request of the banks into offering more and more services to take the burden, the cost burden, the operating burden off the banks. So I would see that trend continuing. It's important to have a look at your own environment and say, like the birds exploit all the food, what's out there that we haven't yet exploited? How can we get a product into a niche profitably and quickly that we haven't yet used? And that comes back to questions of agility and flexibility and attitude. What comes next? This is where, who was it? One of the American football coaches said making predictions is very difficult, especially about the future. So what I'm going to suggest here is we have a diversity of payment tokens, that the card is going to decline in use. Other kinds of payment tokens will arise and become commonplace. What about using your face as a payment token? I have mine with me most of the time. Why can't I go to an ATM and facial recognition? I have a mobile phone. If the camera is pretty good quality, can I use facial recognition? Why would I bother with a PIN? So that's something to think about. The security evolution. We've talked a little bit earlier about blockchain and how that technology for security and transparency may evolve and be developed. We're seeing increasing diversity of issuers and acquirers. That will continue. We'll see new players coming into the world of e-payments, the fintech companies, the mobile network operators. Who else is going to be out there that will move into this space and challenge the existing inhabitants? We're going to see continued geographical spread of e-payments. We'll see the continued growth in mobile payments, and we'll see regional developments coming together. So I think of the e-payments world, I visualize it as a cake. If you don't like cake, you could think of it as a pie. If you don't like cakes and pies, you can come up with your own image. So over the past decades, we've seen the cake getting bigger and bigger and bigger. There is more volume and more value put through the e-payments channels than ever before, and it's grown consistently for decades, and I believe it will continue to do so. So the overall cake is growing in size. New slices are cut in that cake all the time. We're seeing e-money growing. That's a new, relatively new slice, and it's growing. The mobile slice is relatively new, and it's growing. Other slices are in some ways shrinking. So the number of checks in certain places is going down. So you'd think the slice might be getting smaller. Well, in some ways it is, but remember the whole cake is getting bigger. So the death of, for example, paper checks globally, thinking globally, is not yet coming. The death of checks in certain specific areas is on the way, I would suggest. So the old slices tend to stay there, but change shape. Some shrink, some get bigger. And slices will disappear. We talked about the old zip-zap machines, the old point-of-sale acquiring techniques. They've died, they've gone. So we need to think about how is our slice of the cake going to change over the next few years, and how do we position ourselves to take advantage of that change. So I started earlier with the generally accepted definition of evolution in the natural world. I've modified it here to make it the law of e-payments evolution. So I'm saying all e-payments arise and develop through the natural selection of small inherited variations that increase the service provider's ability to compete, survive, and reproduce. So I'm offering that as a suggestion that you can take away when you're looking at the future development and the future evolution of your own payment services. This is the family tree of the dinosaurs. There are no plants on there, there are no fishes on there, but it gives you an idea of how complicated and how interrelated different aspects of natural evolution are. And I'm suggesting the e-payments world is similarly involved and similarly interrelated. So we've only really just scratched the surface today. But I hope it's given you a few thoughts, a few basic ideas to take away. Now I'm happy to take any questions about cakes or pies or even e-payments. Thank you very much.
Rashid Al-Balushi, I'm professor of law, criminal law in Sultan Qaboos University. Actually, my question will be from the different side, from the legal side. Maybe, and you mentioned to the security evaluation. I don't know, it is very huge numbers of cards you mentioned in your presentation, which from, I think, banking side look like very nice and very shiny. But from the other side, from the security, I think, you think this will not affect badly of the what's called the policy of fighting, such as money laundering or financing of terror, like this one. Now, you believe that this problem of money laundering starting from the, put the money on the small scale. So these items or these tools now will help those people who need to do that. So that is mean you give him the keys. Thank you.
I think that's a very important and useful point, thank you, sir, that the fraudsters are as dynamic and as evolutionary as anybody else. So patterns of fraud, patterns of money laundering, I mean, you look at a coin today, lots of the coins have a milled edge. The edge of the coin is serrated. Why? That goes back to the days when coins were made of gold or silver, and people used to cut the edge off. They used to trim them, right? So cheating in the financial world has been with us for hundreds of years. It will continue to be with us. And the fraudsters will move into the new niches. There will be fraudsters who try to generate e-money, e-value, that has no real value behind it, that doesn't have any money backing it up. So it's a constant battle. The fraudsters, the money launderers, the people that finance terrorism will always be looking for new niches to exploit, and the payment service providers and the banks will always be looking for ways to stop them. It's like predators and prey. The lion runs a bit faster, and the gazelle has to evolve to run even faster. So it's a constant and very dynamic world, and it, yes, absolutely goes into money laundering. We'll see how things play out in the future. Yeah, good question, thank you.
Hello, this is here. This is Khaldun Al-Aqili from HSBC Bank Oman. Thank you, Mr. John. A very, very interesting session. We know that technology is an unending milestones. So it's not a matter where and how to start, but how we best deliver it to the front-end user. So my question is that, and based on your experience in many regions, in many countries, so is it the culture, the education, the regulator? If it's all, and my assumption that your answer would be all of them, which one is playing the main role in it?
Okay, thank you. Good question. They are definitely all interrelated. The question is, at a particular moment in time, at a particular place, for a particular product or service, what is the catalyst? And that varies. Sometimes we've seen with the Central Bank of Oman, that has been the catalyst for Oman Net, the ATM switch. It's now being the catalyst for mobile financial services. So in that case, they're the regulator and the service developer is trying to help the market move forwards. In other cases, you can get The demand is there. If we think about Africa, I've worked in Uganda and Tanzania, Guinea. The demand for electronic payment services is there at the grassroots. You were talking about the end user, the customer has a demand. Who moved in to fulfill that demand? Well, it was actually the mobile network operators that were driving the market. In Tanzania particularly, they pushed the regulator to give them the law and the regulations that underpin all these financial services. You can't have the services realistically without the law and the regulations to back them up. But the catalyst and the driver there was the demand from the people, satisfied by the mobile network operators, not by the banks. So it's going to vary. I couldn't give you a single answer that applies everywhere. It's going to vary based on the time, the place, and the kind of service. If there's a demand for a particular service, then that demand will tend to be satisfied. And if the banks are dynamic and active, they can talk to the regulators, and the regulators will come up with the legislation to enable the services. But the demand is the driver. People can use technology to create all sorts of wonderful services. If there's no underlying demand, the services will become extinct, to use a phrase from the natural world, very quickly. We can use technology to produce all sorts of services and products, but if the regulator says no, finished. So yes, different things feed off each other. The core requirement, I would suggest, is the demand. Yeah. Thank you. Any more questions? You can always catch me later.
I have a question regarding one piece of cake which you have just mentioned.
Okay.
The checks. Okay, considering one of the shrinking product under payments. Most of the financial institutions, they have a lot of challenges in regards to checks. In your experience, when do you think this will shrink totally? And how do you look at the challenges on the checks in general?
Okay, thank you. Interesting question about the checks and the way of the world. It varies from country to country. Some countries don't use many checks at all. Some countries are very large users of checks. Generally speaking, compare writing a check, presenting a check, processing a check with an instant person-to-person or person-to-business payment through the mobile channel. It's click, click, and it's done. So consumer demand will drive, because mobile is easier, it's more convenient, it's more efficient. Consumer demand will tend to drive the displacement of checks. Also driving the displacement of checks will be the cost that the check issuers face. So it will take time, but now Oman is launching its mobile services. I would see those starting to displace checks quite substantially as the mobile usage picks up, as more and more people use it, as more and more institutions start to use it. There was an interesting case recently in Afghanistan. They started to pay the police through the new mobile channel. So they paid the police in e-money, mobile to mobile, and the police thought the system was broken. They thought it didn't work because on average they were getting a 30% pay increase. They said, it's broken, doesn't work. No, it was working exactly right. They were actually being paid their original salaries, what they were supposed to be being paid. It had actually been cash before, and everybody had been creaming off the cash. The CO took his cut, the sergeant took his cut, and the policeman got nothing. So, okay, that's an example of mobile displacing cash, but mobile will start to displace checks. And I think now you've got the foundations here in Oman. You'll see over the next couple of years, check usage will go down quite substantially. So if you're thinking of investing in check processing technology, I'm not saying don't do it, because checks won't just disappear overnight, but it makes you think very carefully. How is the environment changing? How is the natural world around us changing? How can we respond to that? So another interesting question. Yes?
Just one addition on the answer of John on the replacement of checks. I totally agree that the checks will continue to decrease, and it will the businesses will put an end to it so soon. I agree with John that the checks will be replaced or superseded by the mobile payments, but this will only happen for the person-to-business payments. On the business-to-business payments, I think that the replacement will not be by the mobile payments, but will be by the direct credit on the ACH. So definitely this is going to be another major reason for eliminating and putting the checks to an end.
Absolutely. P2P, at the moment, mobile is largely something used by the individual. Business to business doesn't tend to go through. But then you have to ask yourself, in the future, will mobile expand to be business to business? Is it appropriate technology for that? But certainly at the moment, you'll see ACH volumes picking up. Now, the organisers have asked me to make that the last question. So,
is that the last one, or is there
one last
for that actually? Abdelhadi Anam from the Qatar Central Bank, Director of IT. I think the concept of replacing checks, I think, in some aspect depends on the law, because if the law doesn't support that, then the checks cannot be, because the check today is the tool of fulfillment to the court, because everybody now would like to, they stick with the checks better tool in hand than the mobile or any other media, by the way. So I think it's not possible for the checks to be replaced unless there is by law, should be backed by law, to be honest.
Yep, I fully agree. As I mentioned in the presentation, any kind of payment service needs to be backed up by the law and by the central bank regulations. Another point I made was that what happens in one country or in one area will not necessarily happen in another. Right? So rates of change will vary across the world. They'll vary from country to country. But a good point. Now, I'm really going to have to sit down before he throws me out. But thank you once again for your time.